Our panel is about the future of clinical trials in myelodysplastic syndromes. And that's particularly important because the structure of a clinical trial is eventually what's going to hopefully lead to the approval of a new drug for myelodysplastic syndromes. So we invited panelists who really deal with the spectrum of clinical trials in myelodysplastic syndromes. We have Rami Kamraji, who's going to be talking about the structure of clinical trials and some of the endpoints that we've recently redefined to make sure that we harmonize them with the endpoints that the FDA is looking for. We invited a representative from the FDA, Kelly Norsworthy. She's actually the person who reviews these applications of drugs to the FDA, and she and her team help determine which drugs get approved. We've invited Rena Buckstein, who's going to be talking about patient-reported outcomes, quality of life, which is so important in patients who have myelodysplastic syndromes, particularly those who have lower risk myelodysplastic syndromes, where we're trying to determine if a drug allows them to live better. And finally, we have Namrata Chandak, who will be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. This is so important to those of us from Miami. So I work at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Miami, where 80% of our population would fall into a racial or ethnic minority group. Focusing on the past 10 years, one of the greatest advancements that's occurred in myelodysplastic syndromes is that we've really started to understand the genetic underpinnings of these diagnoses. And one of the things we've recognized is that myelodysplastic syndromes is comprised of multiple mutations before we actually see the disease in the bone marrow and before a patient starts to experience a decrease in blood counts. As we've understood the genetic underpinnings of this disease, we've been able to identify drugs that target those genetic mutations and hopefully become the undoing of the myelodysplastic syndrome itself. So we now have a couple of drugs that we typically use to treat specific genetic mutations within myelodysplastic syndromes. One, ivosidenib, just got FDA approved for the treatment of patients with MDS who have IDH1 mutations, along with olutasidenib, that also just recently got approved. We also have the drug enasidenib that we use off-label to treat patients who have an IDH2 mutation with myelodysplastic syndromes. If we're not conducting clinical trials today to try to determine the next best therapy for bone marrow failure conditions, we're never going to create the standards of treatment tomorrow. I am so proud to say that I've been able to participate in some clinical trials that led to the approval by the FDA of drugs to treat myelodysplastic syndromes. Well, that means that the patients that I enrolled to those trials were able to get some of these drugs sometimes years earlier than they would have had access to them once the drug was approved by the FDA. So as people participate in clinical trials, they're often able to get access to drugs that are new and they wouldn't be able to get access to off of a clinical trial. And frequently, we can identify treatment options that patients wouldn't have available. Over the past few decades, we've recognized that clinical trials are not one size fits all. Myelodysplastic syndromes is a rare disease. It's diagnosed in about 4 per 100,000 people per year, or in about 20,000 people in the United States each year. Compare that to diagnoses like breast cancer that's diagnosed in over 200,000 women per year, or prostate cancer that's diagnosed in over 200,000 men. So to declare that a trial has to enroll hundreds or thousands of patients to come to a conclusion about a drug isn't reasonable in myelodysplastic syndromes. As a result, we've turned to innovative clinical trial designs that allow us to get answers about the safety and efficacy of drugs using far fewer patients. I think there are a couple of aspects of clinical trials that I find particularly promising. One is, as I mentioned earlier, we're able to focus on patients who have myelodysplastic syndromes with very specific mutations. The more we can identify those mutations that led to the development of myelodysplastic syndromes, the more we can identify drugs that are personalized and really work in a particular patient. The second area is in focusing on things like quality of life and patient-reported outcomes. We've become much more sophisticated in the questions we ask patients themselves about how they're benefiting from a drug. And those questionnaires are specific for myelodysplastic syndromes, and in the future, I think they're going to involve wearables. Those watches that we have on our wrists that record everything under the sun, we're going to be able to turn to those to say, okay, how is somebody really performing, not when they're dressed up and seeing me in my clinic office, but when they're at home and living their lives. One of the questions I frequently receive from patients or families about clinical trials is, will I get the standard of care? Am I going to be a guinea pig? And the answer to that is absolutely you're going to get the standard of care, and a resounding no, you're not going to be treated like a guinea pig. Clinical trials require that we give at least the standard of care to treat somebody. So if it's a randomized trial and patients are randomized to one arm of a study versus an experimental arm, you can bet that in either case they're going to get the standard of care for their MDS, and they're going to be followed exactly the same, if not even closer than they would be if they weren't on a clinical trial. So my guidance to patients is to trust that clinical trials are in their best interest. Part of enrolling in a clinical trial is informed consent. It's my job as somebody who's a clinical trialist to explain to a patient all the risks, the benefits, alternative treatments that a person could receive, and everybody who's going to be involved in their care. And also to tell my patients, once you sign on the dotted line of this informed consent, it's good for the next 5 minutes and then you can change your mind. So patients can always come off a trial when they want to. It's a dialogue. I want to hear from my patients if they're having side effects to a drug and see if we can manage those. And if we can manage them, great, a person continues on that drug. If we can't manage them and those side effects are really affecting a person, that person can come off of a clinical trial whenever they want to. So a clinical trial responsibility lies with me as the investigator and with my patients as participants in the trial, and each of us can press that stop button whenever we want. Each of us can also press the go button whenever we want. It's a really exciting time for myelodysplastic syndromes. We have a lot of new drugs coming down the pike, a lot of opportunities for people to participate in clinical trials, and I think that people with myelodysplastic syndromes are living longer and better than ever.